Welcome to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our show today, Why Taiwan Matters. And our guest joining us via Skype from North Carolina is Dr. Shelly Rigger. Dr. Rigger is the Brown Professor of East Asian Politics at Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. Professor Rigger did her undergraduate work at Princeton University and went on to earn her doctorate at Harvard University. She is one of America's leading authorities on Taiwan affairs and is often called on by the U.S. government to consult on East Asian security matters. Welcome to Asian Review. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be with you.
Great. Well, we want to talk about your book, Why Taiwan Matters, but before we do that, I'm just kind of curious, what triggered your interest in Taiwan? How did you get interested in Taiwan?
Oh, well, I, from a very early age, was really interested in Asia. And back in those days, we might have said even the Orient. When I was a young child, I played with my sister's Japanese dollhouse, and I loved the little book about Ping, the little duck on the Yangtze River. Some of the people watching may remember that storybook. And so when I got to college, when I was in high school, I told all my friends, when I go to college, I'm going to study Chinese. And they all said, well, that's just crazy. But I did study Chinese in college. And my junior year, which was 1982, I took a course on U.S. PRC Taiwan relations. And it was just a couple of years after the U.S. had normalized relations with the PRC. And we were figuring out what we were going to do about Taiwan. And so this seminar was kind of a bunch of college students, deciding Taiwan's future. And I did some research on Taiwan history in that course, and that made me very interested in Taiwan. And so between my junior and senior year in college, the summer of 1982, I went to Taiwan and spent the summer doing research there. And I just enjoyed it so much and really fell in love with the people and the place. And so later on, when I was working on a dissertation on a very kind of risky topic related to PRC politics.
Risky topic? What might that be?
It was a risky topic. It was on Islamic minorities in the PRC.
Okay.
And that was in 1989. And it became very difficult to do research of any kind in mainland China in 1989, much less on something as sensitive as Islamic minorities in the Northwest. So someone suggested, you want to get your dissertation done before you're a white-haired old lady, you maybe ought to think about a different topic. And that I thought about returning to Taiwan, and I've kind of been with that topic ever since.
Oh, wow, that's an interesting history. That's a really interesting history. Well, let's move on to the book. Zuri, could we put that visual up of Shelley's book? There we go. Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island Global Powerhouse. Oh, it's a great book. What's the message?
The message really is, or the part of the book that I think is most important to me, that expresses my motivation for writing it the most, is the observation that I think all peoples are entitled to be treated as ends in themselves and not as means to an end for someone else. And Taiwan it's very complicated. Its history is very contested. There's a lot of controversy about how we should think about Taiwan, how we should understand it. But to me, the bottom line is that there are 23 million people living in Taiwan, and they think of themselves as having an identity that is meaningful, that is coherent. And I think it's important for Americans and for English-speaking readers for whom I wrote this book to not just sort of think of Taiwan as a tool for U.S. policy or for Chinese nationalism or for something else, but to understand and appreciate the ways in which Taiwan's people are really advocating for themselves and do so. So I would say that's the message.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, we had a little technical problem there, but we overcame it. That's very interesting. I like the way you put that as Taiwan's history is so contested. Oh, boy, that is so true. That is so absolutely true. And, you know, you touched on Taiwan identity, and it seems to me that sense of Taiwan identity is getting stronger and stronger all the time. And it probably was increased a few steps as a result of the Sunflower Movement. You know, the part of your book that I really liked, I liked the part where you talked about the ethnic complexities of Taiwan. I thought that you did a really good job with that, and that's really complicated in and of itself. And in a fairly short amount of space, it seems to me that you really very succinctly unraveled that, especially for someone who might never have read any book before about Taiwan.
Well, I was really writing this book precisely for people who, for whatever reason, have an awareness that Taiwan is out there, you know, and is taking space in our attention, that it commands our attention, sometimes on the business page, sometimes on the front page of the paper. And I wanted to give people something to read that would be fun to read and not too heavy, but that would introduce a lot of topics. So not so much in the book, but thinking about how to talk about it, I've sort of developed, I don't know whether I want to talk about Taiwan history as a cake or a sedimentary rock, but one of those two. The idea being that, you know, you start with a base layer, and the base layer for Taiwan, I would say, is really the geography of the island, which is quite spectacular. You know, very high mountains within just a few miles of the ocean. So there's a lot of topography. There's so much variation actually in the physical geography that there are, it's one of the most diverse places in the world for species, especially for bird species, because there are all of these little valleys and places where, you know, one or two birds flew in and they didn't meet any other birds they could mate with for millennia. So they evolved all these individual species. So the physical geography kind of establishes the baseline on which layer upon layer of human settlement and human culture has accumulated. And so the first human layer would be the Aboriginal people, people who, the best paleontology now, the sort of the mainstream opinion in the archaeological world is that the Malayo-Polynesian peoples who spread out all over the South Pacific originated in Taiwan, and that the Taiwan Aboriginal people kind of started the migration that populated the whole South Pacific region. So those are the people who have been there for, you know, thousands of years, inhabiting Taiwan. Then in the late 1500s and really accelerating through the 1600s, people began arriving from mainland China. And so that's a very thick layer of human were migrating to Taiwan mainly for economic opportunity. There were two colonial, European colonial governments that set up there. One Dutch government, the other a Spanish government. And so they kind of managed the fringes of Taiwan. You know, vast sections of the island were totally ungoverned or ungoverned by any of these sort of formal institutions. But parts of it had Portuguese and Spanish colonial rule. And then the local Chinese-originated settlers pushed the Europeans out, and then you enter into this long period of back and forth between mainland China and Taiwan. So between the 1640s and the late 19th century, there's a lot of Chinese migration to Taiwan, and the Qing dynasty took an increasing interest in Taiwan, although they were always ambivalent because the island was so hard to govern and so kind of wild and out of control that there were many debates in the Qing court about whether Taiwan was worth it, whether it was worth the effort. By the 19th century, they were pretty sure Taiwan was worth the effort, and in the late 19th century, they actually incorporated Taiwan as a province of the Qing Empire. But then a war with Japan, and the Japanese demanded the spoils of war, among which they included the island of Taiwan. So the next layer of human settlement and cultural influence then was the Japanese layer. And for 50 years, 50 very important years in the history of China, from 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was a colony of the Japanese Empire. So this is really the period where modern China is forged, right? 1890.
Okay, well, we're having a little technical problem here, but we'll be right back. We're going to try to get on top of this. You're watching Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Shelly Rigger, joining us from Davidson.
I think I'm coming back. Am I back?
You're back? Hey, there you go.
All right, you can't hear me?
Okay. And I think we're going to just go ahead and take a commercial here, and it'll give us a chance to take a further look at this problem that keeps popping up.
Okay.
So we'll be right back. You're watching Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our topic today is Why Taiwan Matters, and our guest is Dr. Shelly Rigger, joining us via Skype from Davidson, North Carolina. We'll be right back.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Keith.
My name's Keith Bettinger.
I knew that.
And I'm the host of ThinkTech Asia.
I knew that too.
Here on ThinkTech.
Fabulous. You got a great show going, Keith.
Thank you very much. And for our viewers out there that are interested in ThinkTech Asia, it airs every Tuesday from 4 to 4:45, and it can be accessed online at thinktech.com.
Yeah, so what kind of guests you like?
Well, we have a number of guests from academia, from practitioners of international affairs. Sometimes we have military officials. Sometimes we have public officials on the show. And our goal, we try to talk about current issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia, all throughout the Asian realm in more depth than you would find in traditional mainstream
That's the
media.
difference, isn't it?
Exactly.
That you're reaching out beyond what ordinary news media would do.
Right.
That's why we like you so much.
We're trying to provide a thinking person's perspective, an intelligent perspective on what's going on, and where both sides of the story, or even when there's more than two sides, we try to cover every angle. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we provide here at ThinkTech. Is it's a really innovative source of educational programming for the people of Hawaii.
You're great, Keith. You are a great host. You got a great show going on. I watch it every week.
Thanks very much.
Why don't you guys watch it every week too, okay?
4:45 to 4 to 4:45 every Tuesday.
Welcome back to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Shelly Rigger, joining us via Skype from Davidson, North Carolina, where she is a professor at Davidson College, a very, very selective liberal arts college. I note in getting ready for this interview that the vast number of students at Davidson major in political science.
It is the most popular major the last few years.
Oh, how interesting. Well, we're talking about the ethnic makeup, the ethnic influences that have, so impacted Taiwan just before the break. As you look at today's Taiwan, what would you say the largest cultural influence has been?
Right, so when we broke off, I was talking about the Japanese colonial period, and it was really important to Taiwan's development to have been, there's a lot of influence of Japan, but at the end of World War II, when the Japanese Empire retracted back to Japan. The empire folded, and Taiwan was handed over to Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, the government of the Republic of China, which at that time was the government of all of China. The Japanese really kind of cleared out. Not a lot of Japanese people remained on the island, and so the dominant influence since 1945 has sort of reinforced that long period of Chinese settlement, so that the ethnic Chinese element is definitely the dominant strain in Taiwan. You know, almost about 98% of Taiwanese have their ancestral roots in mainland China, either from before the Japanese period, that's about 85%, or people who arrived after World War II, that's maybe another 15% or so. So it is an ethnically, historically, or ancestrally Chinese society, but it has these influences from the Aboriginal time, the sort of era of being part of a kind of global colonialism that was much more cosmopolitan than I think most modern people really appreciate, and then this period of Japanese colonialization. So a lot of people in Taiwan would argue that Taiwan is distinctive, that it has Chinese roots, but that the culture, the way of living, the identity that people have is somewhat different from mainland China.
You know, so many people always say, oh, Taiwan is so Americanized. And I think in some respects it is, but it seems to me the Japanese influence goes much deeper, and it colors a lot of just daily life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, it's hard for me as an American to always differentiate well where different influences are coming from, but certainly when you live in Taiwan and you experience the culture very closely at an intimate level, there are a lot of things that are very unfamiliar, and that, you know, politically there's a lot of U.S. influence, and in terms of economics there's a lot of American influence. But, you know, Taiwanese people love their Japanese fashion. They love Japanese music, and Korean popular culture is very big in Taiwan now. So there is a kind of very strong pan-Asian flavor to Taiwan, and then a really profound Chinese cultural base. One of the things that's been really interesting in the last few years, when a lot of mainland Chinese have been tourists in Taiwan, a lot of them say, wow, these guys are still doing like old school Chinese culture. They still have this patriarchal Confucian family ethic, and so there are a lot of different influences in Taiwan, and it has made for an extremely robust culture. You know, my dad's a wonderful gardener, and he always taught me that the hybrid plants were the strongest plants in the garden, and Taiwan is a very hybridized society, and I think that has given it a lot of vitality.
Oh, that's a very interesting observation. Well, let's kind of move on here. Now, and a point that often comes up, and there seems to be definitely different schools of thoughts on this. When we think about Taiwan in geostrategic terms, some people in Washington will say, well, Taiwan has definite geostrategic significance and importance to the United States. And then others will say, no, that's totally wrong. Where do you stand on that one?
I really think, well, first of all, to go back to an earlier point, you know, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that whether Taiwan has geostrategic importance to the U.S. or not, Taiwan people should determine their own fate. So they don't owe us, you know, anything. But with that said, I think we can think about, you know, what difference does it make to the U.S. whether Taiwan is absorbed into the People's Republic, absorbed into some other kind of Chinese national empire or other kind of entity confederation, or remains on its own. And I think certainly what a lot of my friends in mainland China believe is that the U.S. is seeking to contain China, right? To hem in the rise of China, and that Taiwan is a part of that strategy, that it's a line in the ocean that the U.S. can kind of enforce that prevents PRC military and political influence from expanding into the Pacific. And I really don't think that, I don't think that if that were U.S. policy, which it is not, but even if it were U.S. policy, it would be impossible for us to really carry out that policy, because Taiwan people will decide for themselves whether or not they want to be that line, containing China. And right now, what people in Taiwan want is to be able to live the way they have evolved over the last 60 or 70 years, and especially over the last 20 years, in a democratic way. So, I think I can understand how the geo-positioning of Taiwan gives it the appearance of something that has a kind of strategic value to the U.S., but I don't think the U.S. has ever really controlled Taiwan in a way that would allow us, even if we wanted to really use it as a tool either to project American power or to restrict the rise of China.
There's a lot of talk lately that, how should I put it? A lot of suggestion that Taiwan should have a definite role in the U.S. rebalance to Asia. And lots of people are saying, well, Taiwan is too isolated, and with some kind of a role in the U.S. rebalance to Asia, it would help to bring Taiwan out of isolation. I wonder where you stand on that one.
Yeah, that's really hard, because on the one hand, I think Taiwan does need more attention from the U.S., that China's increasing, the PRC's increasing political, economic, and military influence in the world have really narrowed the range of options for Taiwan. And you talk about containment. Taiwan is really contained, right? Their freedom of action is very limited by what the PRC will accept. And because the rest of the region, and including the U.S., all of the nations of the world really want to avoid unnecessary conflict with the PRC, we've all kind of collaborated in pressing Taiwan to be very attentive to the preferences of the PRC government in making decisions about how it's going to manage its own affairs, and in particular, how it's going to think about its identity. Nonetheless, we don't benefit, and even, I would argue, even Beijing, even the PRC, does not benefit from sort of abandoning Taiwan and just saying, okay, we need to be friends with the PRC, so you guys are just going to have to accept your fate and be swallowed up. That, I think, would be a terrible example for the rest of the U.S.'s allies, certainly in the region, but also internationally, right? If they see us saying, we can't help Taiwan anymore, they'll say, well, if you can give up one friendly nation, then who knows where the U.S. would really draw the line. So the credibility of our alliance is at stake to some extent.
I've felt that way for quite some time, that although a lot of other countries sort of want a very hands-off policy or a very under-the-table policy with Taiwan. They also look at the U.S. and how the U.S. handles Taiwan very closely.
Right.
And they look for signals. Because it seems to me that every country in Asia has this fear that somehow the U.S. is just going to pack up one day and go home. And,
Yeah.
and how the U.S. treats Taiwan, as you just said, and as I said, I quite agree with you, is going to have a very large impact on its credibility, not only with Asia, but around the world.
Right. But I also think that it would not be advantageous to the PRC to insist on Taiwan, giving in to its demands for political unification, a form of political unification in which Taiwan would be under the Beijing government, because I think that would just introduce into the Chinese body politic this disgruntled and dissatisfied and kind of permanent, a permanent problem for the PRC. So I think to the extent to which the U.S. gives the impression that we're moving away from or turning our back to Taiwan, that can create a temptation in the mainland to say, okay, this is our opportunity. But it's not an opportunity that can be easily grasped or easily won. So I think in a way, the U.S. needs to stay engaged, both for the sake of Taiwan and our allies, but also for the sake of making sure that we don't kind of mislead Beijing into thinking that something is going to be easy or even doable, that then turns out to be not easy and not feasible for them. So I worry that the U.S. will, pull too far away from Taiwan. For those reasons, I think we need to stay engaged. But I also think it's risky for Taiwan to be perceived as part of a strategy by the U.S. to contain China. You really don't want to be the close-in entity that is identified as the source of threat. And so I think for the U.S., the real policy challenge in 2015 is to balance, how do we remain engaged enough to send the message to everyone that we're not turning our backs on Taiwan without becoming so engaged that it feeds this fear in Beijing that the U.S. is going to use Taiwan to try to contain or divide China. And, this is why I'm just a professor and not a government official, because I don't really know how you walk that line and how you draw that distinction. But I think it's, wise policymakers will find a way.
Well, yeah, it seems that, it's interesting to me, although I never really asked anyone who's been close to this, involved in, just a government official, for example, who deals with Taiwan issues, as to what other countries in Asia say to them about Taiwan. But it does seem to me that the Japanese are particularly worried about Taiwan's future. And of course, Japan is our #1 ally in Asia. And I'm wondering to what degree U.S. policy towards Taiwan takes into consideration Japanese sensitivities. Do you have any read on that?
Yeah, I think U.S. policymakers do think about that. And I think sometimes my impression is that they think about it with a certain degree of frustration, Why is it always our job to be the strong one? And, all of these other countries or political forces within countries want Taiwan to be strong. They want Taiwan to be kind of resolved in its determination to remain true to its own political institutions, political system, autonomous from the PRC. they want that. That serves their interest. In some ways, it's more important to their interest than it is to American interest, and yet they don't speak up in Taiwan's defense.
I share that frustration. I see exactly what you're saying. A good example might be, okay, if you are so worried about Taiwan's future and Taiwan's security, Japan, and since you no longer have prohibitions on the sale of weapons, why is it that you're just letting the U.S. sell weapons to Taiwan when you have plenty that could be sold, and submarines, which Taiwan seems to desperately need?
We have a whole, school subfield of political science about collective action problems, right? And the tendency, if there is a country that will take the lead, then others will follow, and not take the lead. At the same time, though, we have to be realistic about the, geography, it turns out, is really important. And Japan is really close to China.
Right.
And Chinese leaders have constructed a narrative of history in which Japan is the bad guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was recently talking to a really good friend from China who is a smart guy, and he just said, and I really believe that he fully believed what he was saying. He said, I think the Japanese are gearing up for an attack on China. And I thought, that is inconceivable. And yet, this is how, Chinese are taught to think about it and to view Japan.
I agree.
So I think for the Japanese to be a little bit more robust in how they talk about Taiwan is really risky, because it just feeds that.
The narrative you spoke about.
Yeah.
We're going to take another break here. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Shelly Rigger, joining us via Skype from Davidson, North Carolina, where she is a professor at Davidson College. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Aloha, my name is Josh Green. I'm a senator from the Big Island. I work in the ER there. But on Tuesday afternoons, I get to come and spend 45 minutes to an hour with Jay Fidel and the ThinkTech staff. They're terrific professionals. They help us to bring some of the leading cutting-edge topics here across our state to you. So you can join us at our show on healthcare in Hawaii to talk with leaders from across all the spectrum of health in our state, or you can join us for any other show where we talk about economic development or tourism or some really eclectic programs too. So really, we'd love to see you here on our show. Thanks for joining us and thanks for supporting us.
Welcome back to Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Shelly Rigger, joining us from Davidson, North Carolina, where she is a professor of East Asian politics at Davidson College. We've got about 10 minutes left here. I know there's so much that we can always talk about. It seems to me, in one sense, that the U.S. might be ramping up its relationship with Taiwan. Just to give you a few examples, there's been this creation of sister military commands between the United States and Taiwan. Recently, the U.S. invited the Taiwan military to attend a conference right here in Hawaii about amphibious landings, and the PRC was not invited. The ROC Navy, Republic of China Navy Chief of Naval Operations was invited to the recent change of command ceremony at PACOM. Some statements coming from Assistant Secretary Danny Russell about Taiwan seem to be very warm. And similar statements coming from Deputy Assistant Secretary Susan Thornton seem to be well received in Taipei. course, on the other hand, it seems before there's an election, the U.S.'s policy towards Taiwan becomes more giving. I remember before the 2012 election, you had the visa waiver program created and a couple high-level officials visiting Taiwan. So I'm not sure if this is all pre-election activity, or this really indicates a kind of a shift. Maybe the U.S. being a little bit irritated with China, Chinese salami slicing, and this is sort of a form of American salami slicing. What's your take on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I don't have any special insight. I don't get to talk to the people in Washington who make these decisions. But it does seem to me, I would share your perception that the way that Taiwan is being received in the U.S. in 2015, leading into the 2016 election in Taiwan. So they have a presidential and legislative elections on 16th of January, 2016. It's a much friendlier kind of vibe this year than 4 years ago, or for that matter, 8 years ago, or 12 years ago, right, when we were looking at the re-election potentially, and in the end he was re-elected, of Chen Shui-bian. So I think that this is partially the American officials realizing that probably the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party candidate, is going to win the presidential election, that she has put together a really great campaign team. The other party, the KMT or Kuomintang, they've been in office, they've had the presidency for the last 8 years, they've also controlled the legislature, and people are ready for a change. And I think in 2012, a lot of American officials were uncomfortable maybe with the possibility that the DPP might win the presidency, and they really don't seem to be uncomfortable with that in 2015. That I think they see that it's a strong possibility. It's by no means a certainty, but it's a strong possibility, and everybody's kind of getting ready for that. So part of it, I think, is just kind of not trying to resist something that is likely to happen. You might as well make the best of whatever outcome you get. But I think something else that's going on really is that in the last 4 years, we've felt a lot more heat from the PRC, and people are starting to think maybe U.S. policy needs to change a little bit. And of course, the rebalancing toward Asia was a bit of a shift in U.S. policy to pay more attention to East Asia, including China. But the rebalancing was advertised, and I think with sincerity, not as an anti-China shift, but rather as a way of kind of bringing American attention off the Middle East and Central Asia and toward East Asia, where some of our most important alliances are. But in the last 4 years, so since the rebalancing, or what we used to call the pivot to Asia, I think there's been an increasing concern about China's political ambitions and its military ambitions, and that too may be beginning to alter the position that Taiwan occupies in American policy.
Yeah, I'm of that view myself. It seems to me too that while the U.S., I agree with you, I think the U.S. has pretty well accepted the fact Tsai Ing-wen is very likely to win. The Kuomintang candidate, Ms. Hong, doesn't seem to have a whole lot of support behind her. Maybe someone else will come along. Maybe Wang Jinping will jump into it somehow. But the polling I've seen so far sort of suggests even he won't do all that well against Tsai Ing-wen. It seems to me Beijing has probably pretty well, reluctantly, admittedly, accepted the fact that Tsai Ing-wen is going to win. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think the PRC, we used to say they didn't understand Taiwan, but they totally understand Taiwan now. I mean, there are excellent, excellent people in mainland China, in Beijing, in Xiamen, in Shanghai, and other places who pay absolutely intense attention to the minutia of Taiwanese politics.
No, I agree with you. I
So-
met a lot of those folks. They spend their whole day, from the day they get up to the time they go to bed, thinking about Taiwan,
Yep.
and this way or that way. And, I find that lots of times I agree with a lot of things that they say. I think that within the sort of political constructs that they function, they're pretty objective.
Yeah, they have to. I mean, they're like policy, or they are like think tankers anywhere.
Mhm.
They're providing information to policymakers who have a political agenda.
Mhm.
But if you don't give them good information, then there's going to be trouble. The policy outcomes are not going to be good. But it's not your job as an academic or a person in a think tank or an advisor to a government to say, this is what your political agenda should be. It's
Right.
your job to say, I know you have your political agenda. This is the reality in which you need to figure out how you want to handle that. And so I think that they are providing very good information about what the political reality in Taiwan is, starting with the strong likelihood that Tsai Ing-wen will be the next president.
Right. Oh, our time is running on here. I got two other questions I just really want to ask you here. One thing, I spoke briefly about Ms. Hong a minute ago, and it seems that one of the big things that she's campaigning on is the completion of a peace treaty between Taiwan and the mainland. And of course, this issue has been brought up a couple times more recently. What do you think such a peace treaty would look like?
Well, the one that we've always talked about, there's a sort of a template out there that says, that the two sides would agree that for 50 years or some number of years, 50
We only
seems to
have a
be.
minute and a half. Oh, I'm sorry
Right,
about that.
right. It always goes like that. 50 years, no Taiwan independence, so that Taiwan doesn't run up a new flag or change the name of the state. No unification, so the two sides don't become part of one political entity, and no military conflict. So they sort of freeze the status quo. It's interesting, in some ways that feels like something that the PRC should be more dissatisfied with. That, for people in Taiwan, 50 more years, they've had 65 years of the current status quo, right, since 1949. Another 50 years sounds pretty good, but that idea is also very controversial in Taiwan, where a lot of people think that's the beginning of the end, right? It's what Hong Kong did. Well, it's not what Hong Kong did. It's what the British did on behalf of the Hong Kong people. They made a deal for 50 years of the status quo, and already many Hong Kong people perceive encroachments on that. And, that's another whole show.
Shelley, I'm going to have to stop you here because
Yeah,
I've just
that's
been
the thing
told that
that
we're
I think
just
people
about
forget.
out of time. We will have to have another show on this because, Kurt Campbell at CIS asked Tsai Ing-wen a very interesting question. He says, Taiwan society is so divided. How are you going to bring it together? And that might be a whole show in itself. But certainly, I want to hear your opinion on that, on another show, or a telephone conversation, or whatever. Thank you
Yeah.
very much for joining us today. We just remind our viewers here in Hawaii, there is a 6-hour difference between Hawaii and the East Coast. I really appreciate Professor Rigger allowing us to visit with her maybe a little late into the evening. Thank
My
you very
pleasure.
much for joining us today. Next week, we have a double header for you. First at 3 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time, we'll have Shelley A. Khan, recently retired from the Congressional Research Service, Security Specialist on Asian Affairs. And then at 4 o'clock, we'll have Ray Tsuchiyama, who blogs for Forbes, is on a lot of technical issues and economic issues. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.